The chamber went silent, and that silence was louder than any alarm I had ever heard. I am Vex Thara Own, a cultural liaison of the Skarn Concord, and I was standing in the great ring of Council Prime when a human woman named Claire Bennett said the one word that no species had ever said in that room before. She said no. I felt the air pressure change around me, though nothing in the chamber had physically moved. 500 delegates from across the Federation sat frozen in their seats. Antennae stopped twitching. Breathing membranes stopped pulsing. Even the recording drones, which never stopped moving, seemed to hang still in the air, as if they too could not believe what they had just captured. I had been assigned to the human delegation only 11 days earlier, and in that short time I thought I understood them. I did not understand them at all, not yet. Let me take you back just a few minutes before that word broke the room, because that is where the tension began, and it never let go of me again. The sharing ceremony is the oldest tradition in the Federation. It is older than most of the star charts we use to navigate between worlds. Every species that is invited to join the Federation stands before the Council and hands over their complete technological archive. In exchange, they receive access to the combined knowledge of thousands of civilizations, some of which have been building ships and weapons and medicines for tens of thousands of years. It is called the gift of unity, and it is the reason why a species can go from riding on animals to flying between stars in a single lifetime. Every species accepts. Every species has always accepted. The offer is too generous to refuse. It would be like refusing to breathe. I stood near the human delegation that day, close enough to see the small details that translation screens never capture. Claire Bennett was not nervous. Her hands were steady. Her eyes moved across the council chamber slowly, studying the different species the way a person studies a room, before deciding where to sit. Beside her stood a tall man named Daniel Foss, who wore a uniform I later learned was called a dress uniform, though nothing about it looked designed for comfort. Behind them stood a woman named Grace Ellery, an engineer, who kept glancing at a small device on her wrist as if she were counting something only she could see. The council speaker, an ancient being from a species called the Thren, floated forward on his gravity disk. His voice carried through the chamber without him needing to raise it. He welcomed the humans formally. He praised their swift arrival among the stars. He said the usual words, the same words that had opened every sharing ceremony for centuries. Then he asked for the human archive to be presented so that it could be added to the great library that binds all Federation worlds together. I expected Claire Bennett to nod. I expected her to gesture toward a technician who would step forward with a data crystal or a similar device, containing every schematic humanity had ever built. That is what every species does. That is what the ceremony is for. Instead, she folded her hands in front of her and looked directly at the speaker. She said that humanity was honored to be invited into the Federation. She said her people had dreamed of this moment since they first pointed telescopes at the sky. She said they wanted to learn, to trade, to build friendships across the stars. Then she said that humanity would not be handing over their technology as a gift or as tribute. The speaker's gravity disk dipped slightly, the way it does when he is surprised, though I do not think anyone else in the chamber noticed except me, since I had studied Thren body language for 3 years before this assignment. He asked her to clarify. Perhaps, he suggested gently, there had been a translation error. Claire Bennett said there was no error. She said humanity would share knowledge freely, teach willingly, and cooperate completely, but they would not hand over the blueprints of their weapons, their ships, or their defense systems as a price of entry. She said some things could not simply be given away without also giving away the reasons behind them, and those reasons were not ready to be shared yet. That was when the chamber went silent. I looked around at the other delegates. A Threll ambassador, whose species has 3 eyes arranged in a triangle, had all 3 eyes wide open, which for them signals the highest form of shock. A Corveth trade minister had gone completely still, his usually restless tail frozen mid-swing. Even the Vashtan observers, who prided themselves on showing no emotion at all, had leaned forward in their seats. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when tradition met refusal for the very first time in Federation history. I had arrived on the human homeworld only a short time before this ceremony, sent by my superiors to prepare a report on the newest species to enter Federation space. My orders were simple: observe, record, advise. I did not expect to be standing in the Great Ring when history changed direction. Humanity had been discovered, almost by accident. A listening station near the edge of Federation territory picked up an old radio signal, decades old by the time it arrived, drifting out from a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The signal contained music, of all things, sent out into space with no expectation that anyone would ever hear it. When our scout ships traced the signal back to its source, they found a species that had only just begun sending objects beyond their own moon. By Federation standards, humans were children, barely a century into powered flight, barely a few decades into space travel. Their ships were small, their weapons appeared unimpressive, and their cities, while impressive by their own measure, could not compare to the floating spires of the Thren or the crystal towers of the Corveth. And yet, there was something about them that unsettled me from the very first meeting. When my shuttle landed at their primary contact facility, I expected fear. I expected awe. I expected the same reaction every new species gives when they first stand in the presence of a civilization far older and more advanced than their own. Instead, the humans who greeted me asked questions. Many questions. They wanted to know how our ships worked, yes, but they also wanted to know how many species had joined the Federation and never left again. They wanted to know what happened to species that refused. They wanted to know who controlled the Council, who wrote its laws, and who benefited most from the arrangement. I answered as best I could, assuming this was simple curiosity, the natural excitement of a young species meeting its first true neighbors. Looking back now, I understand that they were not being curious. They were being careful. Claire Bennett had been the one asking the sharpest questions. She held a position her people called Director of Off-World Relations, though I later learned she had spent much of her earlier career working in something called conflict negotiation, resolving disputes between human nations before humanity had ever left its own solar system. She had a calm way of speaking that made everyone around her feel like the situation was under control, even when I suspected it was not. I had assumed, wrongly, that this calm confidence meant she did not understand what she was walking into. I assumed she did not know how rare it was to be offered Federation membership, or how foolish it would be to hesitate. I was wrong on every count. Back in the Great Ring, the speaker recovered his composure and tried again. He explained, patiently, as if speaking to a child, that the gift of unity was not simply a formality. It was the foundation of trust between all Federation members. Every species shared its knowledge, and in return, every species received the combined wisdom of the whole. To refuse was not merely unusual, it was, in the eyes of many delegates, an insult to the very idea of unity itself. Claire Bennett did not flinch. She said humanity understood the importance of trust completely, and that trust was exactly why they were being careful. She said her people had a long history of giving away powerful tools before they were ready for the responsibility that came with them, and every time they had done so, it had gone badly. She said humanity did not want to make that mistake again, not with the Federation, and not with themselves. I watched the Corveth Trade Minister rise from his seat, his voice sharp with irritation. He asked what right a species barely out of its own atmosphere had to withhold anything from civilizations that had been navigating the stars since before humanity had learned to write. Claire Bennett turned to him, and for the first time I saw something shift in her expression. It was not anger, it was something closer to sadness. She said that being young did not mean being foolish, and that every civilization in this room had once been young too. She asked the minister, gently, whether his own people had always used their knowledge wisely from the very beginning, or whether wisdom had come with time and mistakes. The minister had no answer for that. Nobody did. The speaker called for a recess, the first interruption of a sharing ceremony in longer than even the Federation archives could easily confirm. As the chamber began to empty, delegates whispered among themselves, casting glances toward the small human delegation standing quietly near the center of the ring. I stayed behind, watching Claire Bennett as she finally allowed herself to exhale. Daniel Foss placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, and Grace Ellery let out a breath that sounded like relief, mixed with something closer to fear. I approached them, my translator humming softly against my collar, unsure of what to say. In 11 days, I had built a report describing humanity as eager, adaptable, and cooperative. That report now felt useless in my hands. Claire Bennett noticed me first. She offered a small, tired smile, the kind that suggested she had expected this exact reaction and had simply been waiting for it to happen. I asked her, as carefully as my training allowed, why humanity would risk offending the entire Federation over something that every other species gave freely. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. She said that humanity was not trying to offend anyone. She said they simply believed that some gifts, given too early, could become the very things that destroyed the people who received them. She said humanity had learned that lesson the hard way, more than once, in their own short history. I did not fully understand what she meant that day. I only understood that something had changed inside the Federation. Something old and unquestioned had just been questioned for the first time, and I had been standing close enough to feel the shockwave of it settle over every species in that room. I did not know it then, but that recess would give me the chance to learn exactly what humanity was protecting, and why. It would take me far from the comfort of Council Prime, into engineering bays, defense simulations, and quiet conversations with soldiers and scientists who spoke about their technology the way other species speak about family secrets. What I found there would change everything I thought I understood about strength, about wisdom, and about what it truly means for a species to be ready for the stars. The recess lasted only 1 hour, but for me, it felt like the longest hour of my career. I was summoned directly to the office of my superior, an elder Skarn diplomat named Counselor Dren Ashai, whose scales had long since faded to the pale gray that comes with great age and greater impatience. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He told me that the council had never faced a refusal like this before, not once, not in all the centuries the Federation had existed. He said some delegates were already calling for sanctions against humanity, arguing that a species which would not share its knowledge could not be trusted to receive the knowledge of others. He said other delegates, quieter but no less concerned, worried that humanity was hiding something dangerous, something that could threaten the fragile balance the Federation had spent so long building. My task, he said, was simple to describe and difficult to complete. I was to return to the human delegation, embed myself among them as closely as they would allow, and determine the truth behind their refusal. Was it fear? Was it arrogance? Was it ignorance of what they were giving up? Or was it something else entirely, something the council had not yet imagined? I left his office with new orders and an old worry sitting heavy in my chest. In my 11 days among humans, I had grown to like them, in the strange, cautious way one grows fond of something still not fully understood. I did not want to discover that they were hiding something monstrous, but I also could not ignore the responsibility placed on me. I found Claire Bennett and her small delegation in a private meeting room set aside for them near the outer ring of Council Prime. The room was modest by Federation standards, plain walls, simple furniture, nothing like the ornate chambers given to older member species. I later learned the humans had chosen this room themselves, preferring it to a grander space offered to them, saying they were more comfortable somewhere they could think clearly. Daniel Foss stood near a window that looked out over the artificial sky of the station, his arms crossed, his posture rigid in a way that suggested old training rather than natural stillness. Grace Ellery sat at a table covered with small devices, tapping notes into a datapad with quick, precise movements. Claire Bennett was the only one who looked completely at ease, seated with her hands folded, watching the door as though she had expected me to arrive at exactly this moment. I asked if I could speak with them, and she gestured for me to sit. I decided to be direct, since I sensed that humans respected directness more than careful diplomatic phrasing. I told her that the council was deeply unsettled by her refusal, and that some delegates feared humanity was concealing something dangerous. I asked her plainly what humanity's true reason was for withholding their technology. She considered the question for a moment before answering. She said that humans had a long history of conflict among themselves, long before they had ever looked toward the stars. She said their planet was home to hundreds of different nations, cultures, and governments, many of which had spent centuries in competition and sometimes in open confrontation with one another. She said this history had shaped the way humans built things, the way they designed their weapons, their ships, and their defenses. I asked her to explain further, and it was Grace Ellery who spoke next, setting down her datapad and looking at me directly for the first time. She said that most Federation technology, from what she had studied since arriving, was built on an assumption of trust. Systems were designed to work exactly as intended, operated by people who were expected to follow proper procedure, protected by security measures built to keep outsiders away. It was elegant. It was efficient. It made sense for a federation that had achieved centuries of relative peace among its members. Human technology, she said, was built on a different assumption entirely. It was built on the expectation that things would go wrong, that systems would be misused, that the person operating a piece of equipment might not be the person it was designed for, that someone, somewhere, would eventually try to turn any tool against the very people who built it. I did not fully understand what she meant, and I told her so. Daniel Foss finally turned from the window and spoke for the first time since I had entered the room. His voice was quiet but firm. He said that humanity did not build machines that simply worked well. They built machines that failed safely. He said every ship, every weapon, every defense system humanity had ever created carried built-in weaknesses on purpose, hidden flaws designed to be found only by the people who knew where to look. He said this was not a design flaw, it was the entire point. I asked why any species would deliberately build weaknesses into their own technology. Claire Bennett answered this time, and her voice carried the weight of something deeply personal, something I sensed she had thought about many times before this conversation. She said that throughout human history, whenever one group gained a powerful new advantage over another, it rarely stayed in careful hands for long. Weapons built for defense were eventually turned toward conquest. Tools built to protect were eventually used to control. She said humanity had learned, through hard experience, that power without accountability always found a way to be misused eventually, no matter how good the intentions of the people who first built it. She said their built-in weaknesses were not signs of poor engineering. They were safeguards, a way of ensuring that no single person, no single nation, and no single mistake could ever turn human technology into an unstoppable threat. Every powerful system humanity had built also carried the means to stop it, hidden within its own design, understood only by those trained to recognize it. I sat with this information for a long moment, turning it over in my mind. I asked her the question that had been forming since our very first conversation on their homeworld. I asked if she believed the Federation's technology lacked these same safeguards. She hesitated before answering, and I could tell she was choosing her words with great care. She said that from what she had studied of Federation systems during her preparation for this meeting, most Federation technology assumed good faith completely. It assumed that anyone with access to a system was meant to have that access. It assumed that shared knowledge would always be used exactly as intended. She said this had likely worked well for a very long time, since Federation species had built a culture of trust across centuries of peaceful cooperation. But she said humanity did not yet know the Federation well enough to be certain that trust would always be honored, by every species, in every circumstance, forever. And more importantly, She said, humanity did not yet know itself well enough within this new context to be certain that their own people would always use shared knowledge responsibly either. She said, handing over complete technological archives, without also handing over the deep cultural understanding of why certain safeguards existed, would be like giving someone the key to a house without also warning them about the fire that had once burned through it. I left that meeting with far more questions than I had arrived with, and I spent the following days doing something no Federation liaison assigned to a new species had likely ever done before. I asked to see their engineers at work. I visited a facility they called a testing range, a wide-open space surrounded by reinforced barriers, where human technicians ran experiments on prototype systems before allowing them anywhere near actual use. I watched a young engineer named Owen Carter deliberately try to break a piece of equipment his own team had built only days earlier. I asked him why he was trying to damage his own team's work. He looked at me as though the answer should have been obvious. He said that if he could not find a way to break it first, someone else eventually would, and it was far better for his team to discover the weakness themselves than to have an enemy discover it during an actual moment of need. He said this was simply how humans built things. Assume failure, assume misuse, assume the worst case, and build until the worst case could be survived. I began to understand, slowly, that humanity's refusal to share their technology was not born from fear of the Federation, and not born from arrogance either. It was born from a philosophy so deeply embedded in their culture that they could not separate the technology from the thinking that had created it. Their weapons were not simply weapons, their ships were not simply ships. Every piece of human technology carried within it centuries of hard lessons about power, trust, and the terrible ease with which good intentions could turn into something else entirely. I returned to Counselor Ashai with a preliminary report, though I confess it was an incomplete one. I told him that humanity's refusal was not driven by malice or deception. I told him it was driven by a form of caution so deeply ingrained that it functioned almost like instinct. He listened carefully, his old eyes narrowing in thought, and then he asked me the question that would send me even deeper into humanity's world than I had already gone. He asked whether this caution was wisdom, or whether it was simply fear wearing the mask of wisdom. I did not have an answer for him yet, but I intended to find one, even if it meant spending every remaining day of my assignment among the humans, learning to see the stars the way they saw them. I did not know then how soon I would get my answer, or how suddenly it would arrive. The answer came from an unexpected place, 3 days later, in a small briefing room where I had gone to review recordings of human engineering trials with a translator assistant. I was not looking for an answer that day. I was simply trying to understand a species that seemed to think in ways my own people never had. That was when the alert came through. A joint colony, shared between 3 Federation species and a small number of human settlers who had recently arrived to help establish trade relations, had gone silent. The colony sat near a contested border region, an area where Federation influence thinned out and the authority of any single government became difficult to enforce. Communication had cut off entirely, all at once, without warning. Counselor Ashai summoned me immediately, along with representatives from the human delegation. I arrived to find Claire Bennett already present, standing beside a large display showing the last known transmissions from the colony before the silence began. Her expression had changed from the calm composure I had grown used to into something sharper, more focused, like a different version of the same person had stepped forward to handle this new situation. The Council's early reports suggested the colony had come under pressure from an organized group operating outside any recognized government, a faction that had been growing bolder along the border regions for several years. Federation intelligence had tracked them before, though never with much success, since the group seemed to understand Federation defense systems with unsettling familiarity. I asked how that was possible, and a Threll intelligence officer explained, with visible discomfort, that the group had likely obtained fragments of standardized Federation technology over the years, either through old conflicts, abandoned outposts, or simple theft. Since most Federation systems were built on the same underlying principles across all member worlds, understanding one system often meant understanding all of them. I looked toward Claire Bennett and saw that she was not surprised by this explanation at all. She said quietly that this was precisely the kind of situation her people had worried about from the very beginning. When every civilization builds according to the same shared blueprint, she said, then anyone who studies that blueprint long enough eventually learns how to work around it. The Council authorized an emergency response, and to my surprise, the human delegation requested to be included in the response force, despite having no formal treaty obligations to the colony yet. Daniel Foss, it turned out, held a senior position within humanity's defense structure, one that had not been fully disclosed during earlier introductions. He moved quickly, coordinating with a small human vessel that had been stationed nearby for what officials described as routine patrol duties. I was permitted to accompany the response as an observer, riding aboard a Federation cruiser that would coordinate with the human vessel once both arrived at the colony. The journey took several hours, and during that time, I spoke with Daniel Foss about what to expect. He explained, in careful terms, that Federation defense doctrine relied heavily on standardized protocols. Every ship followed the same formations, the same communication codes, the same defensive patterns, refined over centuries of practice among allied species. It was, he admitted, a beautiful system, elegant and efficient when facing an enemy who did not already understand it. But an enemy who had studied that same standardized system for years, he said, would know exactly what to expect, exactly how Federation ships would respond, and exactly where the predictable patterns left gaps. I asked him what humanity would do differently. He said humanity's forces were trained to avoid predictability entirely. Every unit, every commander, every engineer was taught to approach problems differently depending on circumstance, resources, and instinct, rather than following a single approved method. He said this made human forces harder to coordinate on a large scale, which was a real weakness, but it also made them extremely difficult to predict, which in situations like this one could matter more. When we arrived near the colony, the scene confirmed the Council's worst fears. The organized group had taken control of key colony systems, disabling communication towers and surrounding the main settlement with a defensive perimeter that mirrored, almost exactly, standard Federation border tactics. Federation forces moving in with their usual formations would be walking directly into a situation the enemy had already anticipated. I watched from the cruiser's observation deck as Federation Command attempted their first approach, following long-established protocol. Ships moved into formation exactly as doctrine dictated, communication channels opened on the expected frequencies, and defensive shields raised in the standard configuration used across 1,000 worlds. The response from the ground was immediate and precise. Communication jamming activated on exactly the frequencies Federation ships used. Defensive positions adjusted to counter the approaching formation with unsettling accuracy. It was clear within moments that the group below had studied Federation tactics closely, perhaps for years, waiting patiently for an opportunity like this one. Federation Command hesitated, unsure how to proceed against an enemy who seemed to know their next move before they made it. I heard officers debating over the comm channels, torn between falling back to consider new options or pressing forward despite the clear disadvantage. That was when the human vessel made its move. I watched, along with every other observer on the cruiser, as the small human ship broke formation entirely, ignoring every standard Federation protocol for approach and engagement. It did not follow the expected path. It did not use the expected communication frequencies. It moved in a pattern that seemed almost careless, cutting close to the planet's surface at an angle no Federation training manual would have recommended. Daniel Foss, coordinating from the cruiser, explained quickly to the confused Federation officers around him. He said human ships were trained specifically to avoid textbook approaches precisely because textbook approaches could be studied and countered. He said the ship's crew was improvising a path based on real-time conditions, adjusting constantly rather than following any fixed plan. The group on the ground, prepared for standard Federation tactics, struggled to adjust their defenses to the unpredictable approach. Their jamming systems, tuned precisely to Federation communication standards, failed to interfere with the different frequencies the human ship used instead. Their defensive formations, positioned to counter expected Federation movement, found themselves reacting too slowly to the human ship's shifting path. Within a short time, the human vessel had established a secure communication link with trapped colonists inside the main settlement, coordinating a safe evacuation route that avoided the group's strongest defensive points entirely. Federation forces, seeing the opening the humans had created, adjusted their own approach to support the evacuation, finally breaking from their predictable formations under the guidance of officers who were quickly learning to think differently under pressure. I watched the entire event unfold from the observation deck, and I found myself understanding, in that moment, something that no report or conversation could have taught me as clearly as watching it happen. Humanity's technology was not simply different from Federation technology in its construction. It was different in its very purpose. It was built to survive being studied. It was built to remain useful even after an opponent understood exactly how it worked, because the humans who built it assumed, from the very beginning, that someone eventually would. The colonists were evacuated safely, and the group responsible for the incident, faced with an approach they had not prepared for, withdrew from the area rather than risk further exposure. It was, by the account of the officers present, a resolution achieved with remarkably little confrontation, since the humans and the adjusting Federation forces had focused entirely on securing the colonists rather than pursuing an extended engagement. When I returned to Council Prime, I carried with me an understanding I had not possessed before that mission. Humanity's refusal to share their technology was not born from mistrust of the Federation as an institution. It was born from a hard-learned understanding that any system built the same way everywhere could eventually be understood everywhere, by exactly the people it was meant to protect against. I met with Claire Bennett once more before preparing my full report for the Council. I asked her directly whether she had known, when she refused the sharing ceremony, that something like this might happen. She said she had not known specifically, but she had expected that eventually, in some form, the Federation would encounter a situation where its shared, standardized systems became a vulnerability rather than a strength. She said this was exactly the risk her people had tried to explain, even though the words alone had not been enough to convince the Council. She said sometimes people needed to see a thing happen before they could truly understand why a warning had been given in the first place. I asked her what she believed should happen now, given what had occurred at the colony. She said she did not believe the answer was for the Federation to abandon its traditions of shared knowledge entirely. She said unity built on trust and cooperation was valuable, perhaps one of the most valuable things the Federation had ever built. But she said unity should never come from removing the differences between species entirely. It should come from each species contributing what made them unique, while still protecting the wisdom that made those contributions meaningful. I sat with her words for a long while after our conversation ended, turning them over in my mind as I made my way back through the quiet corridors of Council Prime. I thought about my own people, the Scarn Concord, and how readily we had handed over our own technology generations ago when we first joined the Federation, trusting completely that unity meant safety. I wondered, for the first time in my long career as a diplomat, whether that trust had ever truly been tested, or whether we had simply been fortunate enough never to face an enemy who had studied us as closely as this group had studied the Federation. I began drafting my report that evening, knowing it would be unlike any report I had ever submitted to the Council before. I did not yet know how the Council would respond to what I had witnessed, or whether humanity's caution would finally be understood as wisdom rather than defiance. But I understood, at last, why Claire Bennett had stood so calmly before the entire Federation and said no. She had not been protecting a secret. She had been protecting a lesson, one written into the very design of her people's technology, waiting patiently for the day the Federation would need to learn it too. I submitted my report to Counselor Ashai 2 days after returning from the colony, and I expected it to settle the matter, at least for a while. I was wrong again. Instead of easing the tension surrounding humanity, the colony incident seemed to sharpen it. Some delegates saw exactly what I had seen, a species whose caution had proven itself useful in a moment of real danger. Others saw something far more troubling. If human technology could outmaneuver standardized Federation systems so easily, they argued, then humanity possessed an advantage the Federation could not afford to leave unexamined. I learned of the second development almost by accident, through a conversation I was never meant to overhear. I had gone to Counselor Ashai's office to deliver a follow-up document, only to find his door left slightly open and voices drifting into the corridor. One voice belonged to Ashai. The other belonged to a Corvith security director named Thessa Rel, whose department oversaw Federation intelligence operations along contested borders. Thessa Rel was speaking quickly, her voice low but urgent. She said the colony incident had convinced several senior officials that humanity's technology needed to be understood, whether the humans agreed to share it or not. She said a small technical team had already been authorized to examine the human vessel that had assisted at the colony, under the reasonable justification of conducting a routine post-mission inspection. I understood immediately what that meant. It was not an inspection. It was an attempt to study human technology quietly, without ever asking permission, hidden behind the polite language of routine procedure. I did not know whether to feel alarmed on humanity's behalf, or simply exhausted by how quickly old habits reasserted themselves, even after everything the Council had just witnessed. I chose not to interrupt the conversation, but I made certain to visit the human delegation before the day was finished. I found Grace Ellery alone in the same modest meeting room where I had first learned about human engineering philosophy. She was reviewing data from the recent mission, her expression thoughtful rather than tired, despite the long hours she had clearly been working. I told her carefully what I had overheard, choosing my words with the same caution I imagined she would want from someone in my position. I told her that a technical team intended to examine the human vessel more closely than a simple mission review would normally require. To my surprise, she was not upset by this news. She simply nodded slowly, as though she had expected exactly this outcome. She said humanity had anticipated this kind of reaction long before ever arriving at Council Prime. She said whenever a species demonstrates an advantage others do not understand, some of those others will always try to take that advantage for themselves rather than ask how it was built. She said this was not unique to the Federation. It was simply a pattern true of most civilizations, including her own, throughout human history. I asked her whether she intended to stop the inspection from happening. She said no. She said humanity would allow the inspection to proceed exactly as planned. I did not understand her calm response until several days later when the inspection took place. A small technical team, led quietly by members of Thessa Rel's department, boarded the human vessel under the official cover of routine review. I was permitted to observe the process, since my ongoing assignment to the human delegation gave me reasonable justification to be present. Daniel Foss allowed the inspection without objection, standing back with an expression I had learned to recognize as careful patience rather than genuine calm. The technical team moved through the ship's systems methodically, extracting data logs, examining engine components, and copying what they believed to be critical navigation and defense subroutines onto their own devices. I watched them work with quiet satisfaction, clearly believing they had found exactly the advantage they had been sent to locate. It took less than a full day for that satisfaction to disappear entirely. I received word from Counselor Ashai that the copied data had begun behaving strangely almost immediately after the technical team returned to their own facilities. Systems that should have contained straightforward technical schematics instead produced incomplete, shifting information that seemed to change slightly every time it was accessed. Attempts to run isolated tests using the copied navigation subroutines resulted in results that made no logical sense, contradicting themselves in ways that left the examining engineers deeply confused. I went immediately to speak with Grace Ellery, and this time I found her waiting for me, as though she had known I would come. She explained, with the same patient tone she used for every technical conversation, that human technology was built with layered protections designed specifically for situations exactly like this one. She said any system removed from its intended operating environment, accessed by unauthorized users, or copied without proper authorization would automatically begin providing degraded or misleading information, without ever alerting the person accessing it that anything had gone wrong. She said this was not a form of trickery meant to embarrass anyone. It was a basic safety principle her people had built into nearly all of their important systems, precisely because they had learned, through hard experience, that important technology inevitably ends up in the wrong hands eventually, no matter how carefully it is guarded. I asked her how something so complex could be triggered so precisely, without any indication to those examining it. She said the details of exactly how the safeguard worked were something she was not prepared to share, even now, even after everything that had happened. But she said the underlying idea was simple enough to explain. Real understanding of human technology required more than access to its schematics. It required understanding the reasoning, the culture, and the hard-learned caution behind every design choice humanity made. Without that deeper understanding, any system taken in isolation would always appear incomplete, or worse, would quietly lead the person examining it toward false conclusions. I brought this new information back to Counselor Ashai, who received it with a long, thoughtful silence before finally speaking. He asked whether I believed humanity had done this deliberately, specifically to embarrass the Federation officials who had authorized the inspection. I told him honestly that I did not believe so. I believed humanity had simply built their technology this way as a matter of habit, a deeply ingrained precaution developed over centuries of their own difficult history, long before they had ever imagined Federation officials might attempt something like this. He asked what I believed the Council should do next. I told him I believed the Council needed to stop treating humanity's caution as an obstacle to be worked around and start treating it as a lesson worth understanding. I told him that every attempt to take shortcuts around humanity's refusal, whether through pressure at the sharing ceremony or through quiet inspections disguised as routine procedure, had only proven humanity's original point more clearly than any argument they could have made in the council chamber. Counselor Ashai did not respond immediately. He simply nodded, slowly, in the manner of someone who had spent centuries assuming he understood how the galaxy worked, only to discover a species barely a century into starflight had understood something he had not. Word of the failed inspection spread quietly through Council Prime over the following days, though official channels remained careful about how much detail was shared publicly. Still, enough delegates learned enough of the truth to shift the mood surrounding humanity once again. The voices calling for sanctions grew quieter. The voices calling for patience grew louder. I met with Claire Bennett once more during this period, finding her in the same private meeting room, though this time she seemed lighter, less burdened than she had appeared during the earlier tension of the sharing ceremony. I asked her directly whether she had known about the inspection attempt before it happened. She said she had suspected something like it would occur, given how the colony incident had unfolded. She said humanity had chosen not to prevent it, because sometimes the clearest way to demonstrate a truth is simply to allow people to discover it for themselves, rather than insisting on it through words alone. I asked her whether she believed the Federation would finally understand humanity's position, now that two separate situations had proven the wisdom behind their caution. She considered the question carefully before answering, in the thoughtful way I had come to recognize as entirely her own. She said, understanding rarely arrives all at once. She said the Federation had built its traditions over countless generations, and traditions built over that much time rarely change quickly, no matter how much evidence appeared before them. But she said every situation like this one, every failed shortcut and every unexpected demonstration added another small piece toward a larger understanding that might eventually take hold. I left that conversation with a sense that something important was shifting within the Federation, slowly but unmistakably, and that I had been given a rare position from which to witness it happening. I did not yet know how the Council would ultimately respond, or whether humanity's caution would become a lasting example for other species to follow, or simply a curious exception remembered in old records. But I understood, more clearly than ever before, that the true strength behind humanity's refusal was not a hidden threat waiting to be uncovered. It was a hard-earned wisdom, built into every line of their technology, waiting patiently for the rest of the galaxy to be ready to listen. The Council reconvened in the Great Ring 3 weeks after the failed inspection, and I felt the difference the moment I stepped through the doors. The chamber was full, every seat occupied, every species represented, but the mood had changed entirely from the tense uncertainty of the original sharing ceremony. There was no anger in the air this time. There was something closer to curiosity, mixed with a quiet humility I had rarely felt among Federation delegates before. Councillor HFY had asked me to present my full findings before the assembled council, a request that both honored and unsettled me. I had spent weeks among humanity, learning their history, their reasoning, and the quiet philosophy woven into every piece of technology they built. Now I would need to explain all of it to an audience that included some of the very delegates who had once called for sanctions against the species I had come to respect. I stood at the center of the ring, my translator humming softly, and I began. I told the council everything I had learned. I told them about humanity's long history of conflict among their own nations, a history that had taught them, through painful experience, that power given too freely, too quickly, and without deep understanding, almost always found its way into the wrong hands eventually. I told them about the built-in safeguards hidden within human technology, designed not to deceive allies, but to protect against the near certainty that any powerful tool would one day be misused by someone. I told them about the colony incident, where humanity's unpredictable approach had succeeded precisely because it refused to follow the same standardized patterns that had made the rest of the Federation vulnerable to an enemy who had studied them for years. I told them about the failed inspection, where an attempt to quietly copy human technology had revealed, more clearly than any argument could, that understanding a system's schematics meant nothing without also understanding the reasoning behind its design. I told the council, finally, what I believed to be the heart of the matter. Humanity had not refused the gift of unity out of arrogance, or fear, or ignorance of Federation tradition. They had refused because they understood something the Federation had perhaps forgotten over its many peaceful centuries. Knowledge given without wisdom is not truly a gift, it is a burden disguised as one. When I finished speaking, the chamber remained quiet for a long moment, though this silence felt different from the shocked silence of the original ceremony. This silence felt like reflection, rather than disbelief. The speaker floated forward on his gravity disk, his ancient voice measured and careful as he addressed the assembled council. He said the Federation had built its unity on a simple and long-standing principle, that knowledge shared freely created bonds of trust between all member species. He said this principle had served the Federation well for longer than most species present could easily remember, but he said perhaps, for the first time in a very long while, the Council needed to consider whether that principle, however well-intentioned, had grown too comfortable, too automatic, too rarely questioned. He invited Claire Bennett to speak before the council once more, and I watched her rise from her seat and walk to the center of the ring with the same calm composure she had carried during the original ceremony, though this time the chamber listened with open curiosity rather than quiet judgment. She thanked the council for the opportunity to speak, and she said humanity had never intended their refusal to be seen as a rejection of Federation unity. She said unity, to humanity, meant something deeper than simply possessing the same tools and the same knowledge. It meant understanding one another well enough to build trust that did not depend on identical technology, but on a shared commitment to using whatever technology each species possessed responsibly. She proposed something new to the council that day, an idea she said her people had been developing since long before the sharing ceremony had even taken place. Instead of exchanging complete technological archives, she suggested an exchange of people instead. She proposed that human engineers, scientists, and defense specialists would work directly alongside their Federation counterparts, not simply handing over schematics, but teaching the reasoning, the caution, and the hard-learned lessons behind every design choice their people had made. In turn, she said humanity wished to learn just as deeply from Federation species, understanding not just how their remarkable technology worked, but why it had been built the way it had, and what centuries of peaceful cooperation had taught them that humanity, still so young among the stars, had not yet had the chance to learn for themselves. She said true unity was not built by making every species identical to one another. It was built by allowing each species to teach the others what made them different, while learning, in turn, what made everyone else valuable as well. The council deliberated for the remainder of that day and long into the following one. I was not present for every private discussion, but I heard enough through Councillor HFY and other contacts to understand that the debate was genuine and far more thoughtful than the reflexive judgment that had first met humanity's refusal weeks earlier. In the end, the council voted to accept Claire Bennett's proposal, establishing what would come to be known across Federation records as the Exchange of Understanding, a new tradition standing alongside, though not replacing, the ancient gift of unity. Species new to the Federation would still be welcomed with open access to shared knowledge, but they would also be given the choice, as humanity had taken for themselves, to protect and slowly share the deeper reasoning behind their most important technology, rather than surrendering it all at once as simple tribute. I remained on assignment near the human delegation for several months following that decision, tasked now with helping to establish the very first formal exchanges between human specialists and Federation counterparts. I watched Grace Ellery spend long hours working alongside Threll engineers, each patiently explaining assumptions the other had never before considered questioning. I watched Daniel Foss train alongside Corveth defense officers, exchanging hard-learned lessons about unpredictability and caution for equally hard-learned lessons about long-term strategic patience that only centuries of peaceful cooperation could teach. I found myself, more than once, sitting in quiet rooms not so different from the one where I had first spoken with Claire Bennett weeks earlier, listening to conversations between engineers who had begun as strangers and slowly become something closer to colleagues, then something closer still to friends. I thought often, during those months, about my own people, the Scarn Concord, and the technology we had handed over so readily generations ago, trusting completely in a tradition we had never once thought to question. I began to wonder how much of our own history, our own hard-learned lessons, had been lost simply because we had never been asked to explain them, only to surrender them. Near the end of my assignment, I sat once more with Claire Bennett in the same modest meeting room, though this time our conversation carried none of the careful tension that had defined our earlier meetings. She asked me what I had learned, over these many months, about her people. I told her honestly that I had learned humanity was not simply cautious out of fear, as I had once assumed. They were cautious because they understood, more clearly than most species I had encountered, that wisdom cannot be transferred instantly, no matter how much knowledge accompanies it. I told her I had learned that true strength was not found only in powerful technology, but in the patience to understand why that technology existed in the first place. She smiled at this, a genuine, quiet smile, and said that was exactly the lesson her people had hoped. Eventually, someone in the Federation would come to understand. I asked her, finally, whether she believed humanity had made the right choice, standing before the entire Federation and refusing a tradition that had never once been questioned before. She considered the question for a long moment, the way she always did, before answering something important. She said humanity could have accepted the gift of unity that day, just as every other species always had. It would have been easier. It would have avoided weeks of tension, failed inspections, and difficult conversations across the council chamber. But she said easier choices are not always the wisest ones, and sometimes the value of a single word, spoken clearly and held firmly, is worth far more than the comfort of simply going along with what everyone expects. I returned to my own homeworld sometime later, carrying with me a report unlike any I had ever written, and a perspective on the Federation I had never expected to gain. I still serve as a liaison today, though my work now focuses largely on helping other newly discovered species navigate the choice humanity once faced alone, the choice between quick, easy unity and the slower, harder path toward genuine understanding. I think, often, back to that single moment in the Great Ring, when Claire Bennett stood before 500 delegates from across the galaxy and said the one word no species had ever dared to say before. It was not defiance. It was not fear. It was the beginning of something the Federation had needed for a very long time, though none of us, myself included, had understood it until humanity showed us exactly what we had been missing all along. The stars had always belonged to those willing to share their knowledge freely, but it took a young species, barely a century into flight, to remind an ancient Federation that wisdom, unlike knowledge, could never simply be given away. It had to be earned, carefully, patiently, one honest conversation at a time. And that, more than any technology humanity ever built, was the greatest gift they brought to the stars.